If I live in Beijing and Shanghai right now, if I am a supremely educated young professional, like I probably can't afford to buy a home in Beijing and Shanghai. So when even the new economic elites can't buy a house, it's going to be difficult to continue to sell the story of everybody's going to get wealthy.
And now let's go to London. And we're going to have Christophe Kutarna from London, from your office, your home. I hope you will speak a few words and then we'll have floor from your audience, whatever. Okay, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Zhang. I'm a political scientist. My PhD at Oxford is actually in the politics of China. And so I tend to look at any government act from the position of trying to understand the role of power in society. And so that's the lens with which I look at the common prosperity policy. It is so important to humanity that we're exploring the question of how to get there. I think it's probably true that no large country that has gone through rapid industrialization, and Dr. Islam, as you say, we're in the fourth industrial revolution now. No large country that has figured out how to harness capital, how to harness innovation to create wealth, has also figured out the equitable distribution of that wealth. And so as humanity, as civilization, we're still working on that problem. And that there are very ambitious and different projects underway across the globe working on that problem, I think is a good thing. And so it's a good thing that here we have this massive, successfully developing country, which is China, saying, okay, here's how we're going to try to get there. So that's just some of my preface. In terms of a kind of political analysis of why this policy comes out of Beijing now, it makes a lot of sense from a kind of a political economy point of view. And I guess I'll just briefly make 3 points on that. One, I think it's fair to say that the Chinese Communist Party has a historical sensitivity to public instability. I think it's probably fair to say that the Chinese Communist Party looks at itself as proof of what is possible when a counter narrative becomes strong. And although historians have all sorts of theories and explanations for the revolution in the first half of the 20th century, I would think that one of the main narratives from Beijing's perspective is that the Kuomintang lost the support of most of the people. It started to seem to be out of touch with the concerns and needs of most people, particularly in rural areas. And that created the opportunity space for a new narrative to come up, to gain power, to be persuasive. And on the back of that narrative, on the back of offering to offer a more equitable distribution to everyone, we came to power. So I think that there is this kind of historical sensitivity to instability and social instability within the Chinese Communist Party. And I think this common prosperity policy is in part a response to that. My second point would be, okay, well, if we look at modern China today, having gone through the past 30, 40 years of rapid development, and ask ourselves, where are the signs of instability in society today? There are several divisions that have not yet been solved and that are difficult divisions for China to solve. One remains the urban and the rural divide, very different economic outcomes in urban and rural China. Another remains the coastal interior divide, which really hasn't moved much over the past 30 years. There is, as we look across industry sectors, tech has done fabulously well of late. Other sectors, mama hoo-hoo, right? And economic inequality has really shot up. I don't think that it's it's a situation where China is looking at where the US is at and saying, we don't want to end up there with that kind of inequality. Statistically, it's more like we're already there. So when President Xi Jinping talks about a goal of an olive-shaped income distribution, it comes from a place where right now it is a kind of a top-heavy pyramid, or at least that's the shape that we've been building over the past 30 years. And I suppose then my third point in terms of a political analysis is that the Chinese Communist Party needs to renew its source of legitimacy. Originally, we were a revolutionary party, and that was our legitimacy. We won the revolution. But the revolution was 70 years ago. And so, now it's about delivering the goods. We know that economic growth is slowing down. So it's going to be difficult to deliver the goods if what that means is just constant, rapid economic growth. If I live in Beijing and Shanghai right now, if I am a supremely educated young professional, like working at a major consultancy, unless my parents have wealth, I probably can't afford to buy a home in Beijing and Shanghai. So when even the new economic elites can't buy a house, it's going to be difficult to continue to sell the story of everybody's going to get wealthy. And so we need to renew, some of the sources of legitimacy that we had access to in the past. And I think you see that in the language of President Xi Jinping saying that, some of the narratives, some of the legitimacy that we talked a lot about in the Mao era around egalitarianism, that's still part of what's important to us. And if we can put that narrative forth and kind of shift people's expectations from we're all going to get rich to let's build maybe not an egalitarian society, but a more equitable society, then that's what's going to earn the right to rule for the next 50 years or the next 70 years. So that's how I come at this policy. And it makes very clear sense to me how, given the historical sensitivities of the Communist Party, given the many instabilities that remain and have not yet been solved in Chinese society, and in some ways have been made more difficult through the past 30 years of rapid development, and given the need to renew the legitimacy of governing, that a policy like this comes forth and we're like, yeah, we think that this is going to be our vehicle. So maybe what I do in terms of trying to imagine the questions of the audience, and just a very general question that I'll open to all of you is, so none of this has been done yet. This policy is very new. It needs to accomplish a lot. There's not a lot of specificity yet. It's quite vague in terms of what will actually happen as a result of this. And there's no guarantee that it's going to result in that better future that we all want in China. So while we've just spent a lot of time talking, with confidence about what is going to happen, I think we would do a service for our audience to this if we also spent a bit of time talking about our doubts of why might this not work? What's going to get in the way? How is it going to be difficult to achieve some of the aspirations of common prosperity? And again, thanks very much for the opportunity to be here and bring some of these questions to this conversation.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Could I perhaps take this opportunity to really try to answer a question, a few points raised in your talk? Indeed, if you look at the gaps between rich and poor and between regions, I would say the Chinese case is relative deprivation. In other words, it's indeed a miracle that you have lifted over 700 million people out of abject poverty. We made a calculation. If you look at the government inputs and household assets and all this together, I can see the poorest people in China today is much better than those 500,000 or more homeless in Los Angeles, San Francisco, and New York in skid rows, much, much better. Because we made a rough calculation. We go to Yunnan province, the mountain areas, the poorest of poorest county. We have already succeeded in ensuring medical insurance for all, education for all, and housing for all. So this bottom is already there. So what we should, of course, do much better to raise their level to a higher level. And in the West, actually, people use more of this Gini coefficient to analyze Chinese case and other cases, other countries. My own thinking is this is likely a challenge for analyzing a country as large as China. If you look at the Gini coefficient for the whole country, for China, that's rather big. It's 0.747 or something. But still, it's narrowing down a bit. But if you look at the Gini coefficient within Shanghai, within Jiangsu province, or within whatever provinces, in other words, rather than this huge scale of China, a continent, but you look at a rather limited scale, then it's basically all reasonable. But what's more important, you're right in making a point that this sensitivity to social instability. The Chinese have a very strong culture for you call egalitarianism. As Confucius famously said, don't be afraid of poverty, but you cannot have polarization. Indeed, the long-term strategy since Deng Xiaoping in the early 1980s, he said would allow some people, some region to come out first, prosperous, and then bring the rest into common prosperity. So that's a strategy for 30, 40, 50 years. Now we're at this stage. And then if you look at the regional differences, I've been to all these interior provinces over the past 5 years. For at least 15 years running, all China's internal and western part of China have developed faster than coastal China. And there is what I call interactive relationship, positive interactions between coastal provinces and the interior provinces. So this is no longer a major concern in China. A major concern is how to overcome and narrow this relative gap as the Chinese cultural tendency towards common prosperity. And then for this idea of common prosperity, maybe you fail to notice a very interesting project, because the government of China, Beijing, has identified the Zhejiang province as a pilot project province for common prosperity. The idea is by the year 2035, which means 14, 15 years from now, China will achieve basically common prosperity for the whole country. But for Zhejiang province, it will be the year 2025, which means 4 years from now. Yeah, because Zhejiang has a better starting point. If you look at the rural urban divide gap, it's roughly close to 2 times. For the whole country, 2.6 times. So the idea is by the year 2025, Zhejiang will basically achieve that. And by year 2035, the whole country will basically achieve that. And usually, as you follow China closely, China is fulfilling its plans better than most other countries, if they have any plans. I just make this brief comment.
If I could just add something, Chris. The first point you made, that the Chinese Communist Party, as you said specifically, are concerned about social stability. Name a country in which the government is not concerned about its own social stability. China, concerned about its social stability, is key to allow the country's economy to continue to grow and progress, science and technology to develop. So it's not a conspiratorial theory that China is concerned about social stability. Without social stability, you don't get investments, you don't get progress, you don't get further better improvement of life. So any government will be keen. So I don't think that your first point about the Chinese Communist Party is particularly concerned about this. Actually, I think the Chinese government is less concerned about it than many other countries today, because living in China, we're living in Beijing now for 30 some years. What I've seen is the confidence of the government is far, far beyond that of many other Western or other countries' population in terms of confidence in their government. We've seen how they dealt with the pandemic. We've seen how US president wanted to inject things into his vein and use Clorox to rinse his mouth, to the Chinese that admired the US for so long, for so many years, now all of a sudden have a feel that, gee, our government seems to be more scientific and strategic and does a better job of governance than what we see in America and elsewhere. So I think the confidence of the masses are actually quite high. As many of my foreign friends who live in Beijing and Shanghai have said, this is the place where they feel the most comfortable and absolutely the safest in than walking the streets of New York at midnight. So I think, yes, there's always concern for social stability. Yes, there's always a hope that there would be no polarization in society. But China is probably less concerned about that than many other countries. And the population seems to be more comfortable. Well, Professor Zhang, I think, addressed perfectly, much better than I can, the details of the plan, and in terms of the provinces and what actions are being planned and implemented. But as an investor in China, and have been for a long time, and work with the investment community for the last 3 decades, everything is relative when you look at global portfolio management. And we really, really do see, in terms of China, there is social stability, there is continued room for growth, and there is probably better opportunities for profitability than many other places. Thank you.
And any questions from your audience?
Yeah, well, so loving that we're getting into this discussion now. And, you know, one thing I'll just try to emphasize again. So I'm a scientist, right? I'm not an opinion maker. I'm a political scientist, not a politician. I agree with you, Professor Zhang. I mean, a lot of the coverage just of China in general in any Western media, you know, tends to be accusatory, or, you know, looking for, you know, the deviousness within everything that Beijing does. That's not where I'm coming from. You know, I'm coming from this with a scientific lens, genuinely curious about how the world works, about the different political projects underway in the world. So please don't feel that points that I'm making are things that need to be defended against. I'm Canadian, not American, if that helps, just to clarify.